You're listening to the Sass podcast. I'm your host, Christy Rocha, also known as Sass. I identify as a woman, a wife, and a mother. That should tell you a lot already. And over the last few years, I've learned the value of talk therapy. I have seen how my inner work not only enhances my own well-being, but also my marriage, my parenting, my relationships. And in fact, you wouldn't be hearing this right now if it weren't for the work I've done. My mission is to debunk the misconceptions and stigmas around what therapy is and who it's for. Let's normalize working on our mental health and seeking help when needed. We've all heard of self-care, self-help, and self-love, but do you often wonder how to actually make it all happen? I do. You'll hear strategy-based conversations with professionals, as well as inspiring and validating stories from women who are just like you and me. Think of this podcast as the weekly therapy sessions you didn't know you needed, with a dash of sass, a lot of vulnerability, and me, relentlessly asking, but how? Hello, and welcome to the show. My guest today is Dr. Timmesha Butler, a licensed clinical social worker and assistant professor in the School of Social Science and Human Services at Ramapo College of New Jersey. Dr. B provides psychotherapy in New Jersey and Virginia. She received her master's in social work at Howard University and her doctorate of philosophy from the National Catholic School of Social Service. She has a special research interest, say that 3 times fast, in educational practices and policies and promoting social justice for students of color and students with disabilities. So today, Dr. B shares with me her personal story that led to where she is now, including how she pivoted from law school to social work. We talk about her experience as a Black woman with a PhD, her love of working with teens and advocating for children with individualized education programs. We talk about mental health and college-age students, and this whole conversation is more or less a call for greater empathy in our education systems, and Dr. B shares why it matters. Really love this conversation, and I won't keep you from it a minute longer. Here's Dr. Butler. Hey, Dr. Butler, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Hello, how are you?
I am okay. I'm a little under the weather, so I sound like a little, I don't know, a little child, but I'm pushing through.
I get it. I've been having the same issues where it's like every now and then I get like something in the back of my throat. I'm not sure what it is.
Yes.
It's like, oh, I feel itchy.
Yes, totally. It's exactly what I'm dealing with. But anyway, I want to get to you, obviously. So you are a licensed clinical social worker, and I first want to ask you, what is the difference between that and like an LPC, a licensed clinical counselor? Licensed professional counselor, excuse me.
Yeah, of course. So, without having like a lot of information exactly about like the trajectory that it takes to become an LPC, I always tell people that when it comes to like professional counselors, psychologists, and social workers, we all really study like similar theories, if not like the same theories at certain points. I think that it's the practice models that come into play that are altered a little bit, whether or not you're an LPC or a licensed clinical social worker or a psychologist. But in regards to like what you can do with those different roles, we can all be counselors or therapists. The difference is with social workers, when you're a licensed clinical social worker, there's so many other things that you can do, right? So I can be a clinical social worker. So that means I can do therapy. I can do some macro work if I wanted to. And so for me personally, I just feel like when it comes to the field of social work as compared to like LPC or psychologists, I just feel like it's broader. But that's my personal opinion, right? And again, that's not knowing like too much in detail about like how they go about obtaining their licenses. But when it comes to like what's at our core, we pretty much all study the same theories.
Okay, that's good to know. So, and for the purposes of anyone listening to my show, if they're looking for help, they shouldn't feel, turned off or unsure of the different acronyms in that sense. Like they're going to be able to go to someone like you and get the help that they need if they're looking for a counselor.
Absolutely, absolutely. When it comes to like becoming an LCSW, so a licensed clinical social worker, the trajectory of that is this: like you get your master's, right, and then 2 years, you get your master's, and then you have to sit for a board exam to get a graduate license, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
at that stage, you can practice, and you can do therapy, but you have to do it under the supervision of a licensed clinical social worker. And
Gotcha.
so in order to become a licensed clinical social worker, you have to have a certain amount of like clinical hours
Mm.
in order to get that license, which means you would have practiced therapy, you would have done therapy. And so I always tell people like you should never be discouraged. And I promote, if you feel comfortable with the LPC, a licensed clinical social worker or a psychologist, I promote all of that because I think that we can all provide some assistance in our own unique ways.
Yeah, yeah. And what made you want to do this? Why did you get involved in this field?
It's like I landed here to
Mm.
be honest. So when I was in undergrad, I thought that I was going to be an attorney.
Mm.
And so I went in as a philosophy major, and that was horrid, 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 horrid. It was so bad, and like I'm not used to being a C student. I was like getting C's, and I was like, okay, well this isn't gonna
Oh
work.
no.
And so I still thought like, okay, that doesn't mean that I can't be an attorney, right? It's just I need to switch my major. So I switched to a major. I went to University of Maryland, and so I switched to a major called family science because
Mm.
when I wanted to be an attorney, I always wanted to work with families and children. And so I switched to family science, and as part of our graduation requirements in our senior year, we had to do an internship. And our internship has to be something related to like the fields of family science. And so I was fortunate enough to intern with a place called Unity Healthcare in DC that offered like healthcare to the homeless and to the underserved. And I worked with a social worker, and I loved it. But at that point, I still wasn't sure, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't until I went to take the LSAT that I didn't quite study for. And in the middle of the LSAT, I was just like, okay, no. Like I called my mother immediately after and was like, how would you like it if I was a social worker? And she's like, I don't care. Like do whatever you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I, instead of going to law school, I went and got my master's in social work. And that's how I got here.
Interesting. So at this point, is the any desire you had to be a lawyer like completely gone? It's off the table. You're very happy where you are.
Oh, absolutely. There is no more schooling for me. I've hit my max
You've
when it
done a
comes
lot.
to yeah,
Yeah.
I've hit my max. And I think that my skill set is as much I operate, I guess, to my full capacity in where I am. And I know a bunch
Hmm.
of amazing attorneys. And so if ever I feel like I needed, that type of I don't know, that type of expertise, I can access it very, very easily. But I think that when it comes to being an attorney, I think that I'm better suited here, if that makes any sense.
Of course, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a wonderful sense of self, right? You
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
totally see yourself for what you are and where you excel and are leaning in. And I
Absolutely.
love that because you know what? It not everyone can do that, and not everyone um would have switched gears like that, would have said, you know what, this is what I was supposed to do, this is what I wanted to do, this is what I thought I wanted to
Right.
do, and they would have kept pushing through and maybe ended up not so happy.
Right. 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 Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So now you're also a professor.
I am.
What do you teach?
I teach social work courses. And so I teach social work courses, mainly courses that focus on diversity and issues of diversity within the field of social work. And I also teach research courses. I also teach things like CBT, but those are like the one-off things that I teach. But like my core, the ones that I am that are my favorite are the diversity class and to teach research practices to
Mhm.
social workers, and mostly because social workers hate the idea of research. And so I like to teach the class because I like to bring a different element to it so that it doesn't feel so much like a drag like it normally
Mm,
feels.
okay. How do you do that?
I think that I've been in school for so long, and so, or I was in school for so long, and I think one of the
Yeah.
things that I took away from it is like thinking about the classes that I enjoyed the most and like what I enjoyed about those, and then bringing those elements into my classroom, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so that's things like just authenticity, right? Like when you're a professor, I think that that's one of the most important things that you can do is just to be yourself and be a human. I do a lot of like group activities with my students. I give a ton of examples. That's like one of the things that my students always say is like she always gives the best real life examples to kind of
Mm-hmm.
help them put it into practice, because otherwise it just feels like a bunch of concepts that they'll never use.
Totally. Yeah. So are you also working with students as a counselor, or are you strictly there in as the professor role?
Strictly there as a professor role. The university does have a counseling center for students
Mm-hmm.
if they ever feel like they need that kind of assistance. But we're not really allowed to kind of like cross in that kind of way or like blend the relationships in that kind
Oh.
of way.
Mm.
But as a social worker, it's kind of hard because students come to you with things all the time and all of the issues that they're facing. And so, you always practice empathy, but if it's something serious, like there's nothing that I can necessarily do because it kind of compromises our student and professor relationship when you cross that boundary.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think I was curious, so maybe not on a one-on-one level, but as a professor in a setting with college age students, are there is there anything about that age group with regards to mental health that you find surprising or interesting or motivating or anything? I don't have a lot of experience now with college age students. I still think of myself as that age, but I'm not.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm so not. But I just curious, just maybe just as an observer, what your thoughts are on sort of generally speaking that age group and what's going on at this point in 2021.
Yeah, I think, when it comes to college age students, and I think that, problems are the same, right? Like
Mm,
from, anxiety is always there, sadness, depression's always going to be there, feeling overwhelmed, perfectionism, right? Like all of the things that you experience as a kid in like your primary ages or in high school, but it's manifested in a different way because not only are we talking about college age students who care about doing well, but life is also happening to them, right?
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
so trying to figure out a way to find a balance where, before when you were a kid or in high school, if you were fortunate enough, all you had to do was worry about school, right?
Right.
But as an adult, right, because I have mixed age students. So I have some students who take my classes that are freshmen. I also teach master's levels classes where
Mm,
we've had, some students in my class that are, much older than me, and life is happening to them. And so it's like, how do you find a balance and then also try to encourage and motivate your students to be able to produce good work when things are happening in their homes, right? When they have
yeah.
real life adult issues and concerns, and then trying to figure out how to bridge that gap when doing well in education is very difficult to do sometimes. I've had
Mm-hmm.
students who didn't have places to live. I
Wow.
had students who didn't have parents to support them, and
Mm-hmm.
so you get emails like, I can't make it to class today because I didn't have anywhere to sleep last night, right? And so
Wow.
it's these real life complications that are at play that just increase things like anxiety and depression and anything else when you are this age.
Wow. Yeah, I mean that's incredible. You don't even think of it that way. But I can totally see that. I mean, I've thought about what it would look like if I went back to school, and
Hmm.
I actually now now that I'm doing this, I'm not sure that I still have an interest in it, but I had that moment of, yeah, it sounds great to go sit in a classroom with, people who are as passionate and motivated about the same thing that I am. How wonderful. And then I thought, yeah, but then you're going to have to come home
Right.
and do the work while the kids are running around, and you have to make
Absolutely.
dinner and you got to do this and drive them to soccer. Like, I was like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, we got to really think this through.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what I really love though is because we are teaching new social workers, and this is the field of social work, I like to believe that most social workers, I know that at my institution we're really good at this, but we practice empathy so much, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas sometimes with a math professor it's just like it is what it is, but
Right.
we're trained differently. So we're trained to lead with empathy. And so we get situations like that too, where it's like, I had the kids, I didn't have a babysitter, right? So
Right.
do I need an extension? Do I need assistance around this? And so I love being a social worker and being an educator because I have the ability to see a whole situation and not just a student.
Yeah. And as you're talking, it just seems to me that there should be some level of that training or what. And yeah, because let's not just let the math professor off the hook, right? Like,
Right, right.
people have stuff going on no matter what courses they're taking. I mean,
Absolutely.
just empathy as a whole in our society, we need more of it, right? But
Absolutely.
as professors, where you're actively have an influence and you're trying to, someone is there to build a life for themselves. I feel like there should be some level of training, or I don't know what else it would be, incorporated across the board.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that, when you think about like some people aren't, they don't start off as educators, right? Like they
Mm,
don't go through the process of like teaching young
mm-hmm.
kids and then growing into the world of academia and higher ed. And so sometimes, you just jump into teaching because you're passionate about a subject, but
Yes.
there is no real training around teaching sometimes, right? Like I got my PhD, so I had a class on teaching adults, right?
Yes.
So that helps me a little bit. But some people just, if you're really good at engineering and you're passionate about training, then you might go and be an adjunct, and then that might spiral off into being a full-time professor. So I think that you're right to say that there needs to be some level of training on empathy and just
Mm-hmm.
how to deal with humans, right, who have real life
Totally.
problems.
Yeah. I'm thinking of my freshman year. I had a similar situation to you in that I thought in order to own my own business that I needed to go to the business school within my
Mhm.
university.
Mhm.
And so I started in the business school, and there were a couple of required courses. Long story short, I quickly changed out of the business school because I
Yeah.
had 35 tutors trying to teach me how to do accounting one. But
Mhm.
I had a required course. It was called International Business my freshman year, my first semester, and the professor was exactly as you're saying, someone that was in DC, that was very well known, and basically he had done the experience in the workforce that applied to this class, but he wasn't a professor,
Right.
and he was. I think if you for the kids that were really into it, he was great. But for
Mhm.
me,
Mhm.
I'm sitting there in a required course going, "What? Like
Yeah.
this is not working for me. You're not speaking a language I understand, and going for extra help and this and that it was a tough push and pull because the sort of I guess skill set needed then for someone who's like me, not so interested and not really the right, I don't know, I don't know, with the right brain for the subject matter. It was like
Yeah.
he was looking at me like I don't really know. You know what I mean? He's like,
Yeah.
I don't really know how to help you. I'm like, what?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what so being in that realm, being a professor, being in this world, what are some changes that you would like to see maybe across the board in academia, other than, like, I think empathy we've exhausted, but do you think there are other changes needed within higher education to sort of make for a better outcome for all students?
Yeah, I think that, when it comes to higher ed, one of the things, and I don't know if this is very like counselly or social worky, but like one of the problems that I had primarily with like undergraduate institutions in higher ed is that I feel like we force students and really kids, right? Like to
Yeah.
make decisions about the rest of their lives too soon.
Mm.
And so, you are 17 years old applying to college, right, at 18, and you're forced to like jump into some type of like major, right, to have a course of action.
Yes.
And I think that the way that the system is designed at this point, there's not a lot of freedom and opportunity to kind of move around in that space unless you want to spend 6 or 7 years in undergrad, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't really know the solution to that, but I've seen so many times where, because we're so structured in so many ways in education, we don't allow people the opportunity to fully explore and to really find things that they're passionate about, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's like if you think that you want to do science and you start off with science, right?
Right.
But there's so many people that I know, right, who graduate from college with these crazy degrees, and and then they go off to be a chef,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yes.
or they go off to do things like interior. I have a friend who she's absolutely amazing. I think she did economics in school with me, and she graduated. She worked for the government for a little while, but she's an amazing interior designer, right? Like, she has deals with Home
Right.
Depot.
Wow.
I have a cousin who went, and I think he might have did like kinesiology, and now he wants to cook, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's like, well, how do we exercise a little bit more flexibility in academia across the board? And
Mm-hmm.
I think that if we do that, we put people in better positions, right? Especially because we're talking about the fact that college is expensive.
Yeah.
So imagine spending so much money and being forced to make a life decision so soon when you're so young, and then having to pay for it and no longer use it.
Totally. Yeah.
Right. So I think that if there is one thing that I can like pinpoint immediately, I think that I feel like, overall, we just need a lot more flexibility and a lot more understanding about like where our brains truly are, where our brains are at that age,
Mm-hmm.
because we're not at the age where we can make these hardcore life decisions that I think college requires of some of our students so soon.
Yeah. And then when you think about how that plays into adulthood, you have a lot of people who end up in fields and professions that don't suit them, and
Right.
maybe they aren't happy, and then it's a whole identity crisis of, what do you mean? I've been studying to work in finance for the last 6 years. I took all the
Right.
tests, I did all the things, and now I get here and it's like, this isn't fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
then it's like they have to shift their whole life around. Yeah, I'm sitting here doing a podcast on mental health, and it somewhat applies, but not really. Like, I graduated with an English and sociology major. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I can think back to certain things that, what actually it is that was my way of sort of saying, I think I'm really interested in this sort of thing, like the sociology thing. I wouldn't go full force psychology because it just
Yeah.
didn't feel like, I don't know if it didn't feel like that was okay, or I don't know. I just couldn't wrap my brain around really what the end result of the education would be. What would the job be? And so
Absolutely.
I like sort of dipped a toe in it with sociology. And now I'm sitting here like, wow, I'm doing this podcast on therapy and mental health. And so many people say to me, well, you're not a therapist? Don't you want to be? I'm like, well, I guess I could have been at one point. I might
Yeah.
not could have been I guess saying, if I had really had more time or more bandwidth to explore, that might have
Absolutely.
been the end result.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Yeah. So speaking now more of your experience there as a professor, I saw your video on Instagram about, some of your students, I guess, struggling with addressing you as doctor.
Oh, absolutely.
What is that
Absolutely.
about?
So I think that there's a real struggle, right? And I think that there's two things happening when it comes to me as an individual, right? Like this idea of intersectionality, right? Like I'm not only a woman, but I'm a Black woman.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that a lot of the times, my students, and I look fairly young, my students will see me, and there is no, I don't know, like I feel like they don't feel reinforced to call me by my name, right? To call me by the name that they should be calling me by. And I've had some experiences where it's like they blatantly disregard it, right? Like I have in my email tagline, and I even make it simple, right? Like you don't have to call me Dr. Butler. You can call me Dr. B, right? Like you can call me Professor Butler, but ma'am, or I get Miss, or I'll get Miss Timmesha, right?
Oh,
And so it's just like a blatant disregard for the fact that like I have my degree, right? Like I'm a
yeah.
doctor, and I'm not even really the kind of person to, you know, say like call me doctor, right?
Right.
But there is some level of respect that comes along with it, because when I see the difference in how my counterparts are treated, right? Whether it's a professor who's a white woman or who's a white male, there's an automatic assumption that these individuals have their doctorates, right? Like it starts with an automatic assumption. So even if you're wrong, you'll get corrected on the back end, and someone will say, "Oh no, like I'm not a doctor." But for me, the automatic assumption is that I don't have that level of degree.
Oh,
And I think that it's very, very frustrating, right? Because I
yeah.
think that every single year I have to correct people, and it gets draining. It gets draining.
Yeah. Yeah. I just don't even, I can't even imagine having such a lack of respect. And I don't know. It's heartbreaking that that's still something that's going on. And that's
Yeah,
still something that, you had to do a whole video about and that I had to come on and ask you about because it
absolutely.
was almost a little hard to believe. And I don't mean that in that I don't
Yeah, I
believe
know what
you.
you're
I
saying.
did, but it
Yeah.
was like, what? Like,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
is 2021. Like, what?
Yeah, yeah, and it's very, very common, right?
Yeah.
Like very common. There was a video, I'm not sure what the woman's name is, but there was a video a while ago. There was a black woman, and I'm not sure if she was like a politician or what she was, but or no, I think she might have been in academia. But she was on like a call, like, and I think she was in North Carolina, and this guy refused to call her by her name. Like she kept saying to him, like, it's doctor. And he blatantly was disregarding her, calling her by her first name. Like it's just, it's surprising yet predictable.
Yes.
Right? Like
Yeah.
it's surprising that people still have the audacity, but it's also predictable of the fact that like we do live in a world where it's not expected. People don't expect for women to have this kind of stature, right? Like,
Yeah.
or people don't expect women to have this level of education. And especially for me as a black woman, it's almost like double the fact that you don't expect for me to walk in the door as a person who has earned her space here.
Hmm. Do you think that that mentality, and I know you're still employed by a university,
Yeah.
but do you think that mentality comes from the top of the structure within the school, or where is that coming from?
Um, I wouldn't. So for me, I have to be honest, I am very, very lucky or blessed, right? To I'm a professor at assistant professor at Ramapo College, and I absolutely love it there.
Hmm.
I think that when it comes, our president is a woman. She's new, but she's
Mm.
a woman. And I think that for me and my institution, it's a liberal arts university. It's very small.
Hmm.
I wouldn't say that it comes from the top,
Good.
right?
Hmm.
I won't, there's been other institutions where I've experienced something a little different,
Hmm.
right? But I think that it's just a societal norm at this point,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Where people just have their certain biases and expectations of people, and then you see them come out in the ways that they communicate, right?
Yeah.
In the most simplest passive ways. But I think that it's more about the fact that it's just a social norm,
Yeah.
right? Like it goes beyond the walls of the institution. I think that we deal with this constantly just in society.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, it's for you the double whammy. I think that
Yeah.
women are dealing with it everywhere, and then you
Hmm.
add that you're a black woman, and it amplifies. And we all have to continue to do the work. I'm not going to ask you what needs to be done. We all know. We all know.
Right.
Everyone
Right.
needs to go and soul search for a minute and
Absolutely.
and take ownership of the role that we play in perpetuating this. And I'll say for myself, you know, I didn't realize, even just as a white woman, not being actively against any culture, that not fully being vocal about, what is the word I'm looking for? Like, there's a difference between not being racist and not being biased, and actually being actively
Yeah, yeah,
talking
yeah.
about it and being about it and doing the work. And I'm not I'm not proud of
Yeah.
how long it took that realization to sink in,
Hmm.
but it's it's crazy how the ripple effect really is at play, right? I mean,
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
just, yeah, I don't know. I'll leave it there, because I know that you could probably go on, and I don't want to
Yeah,
keep
absolutely.
rambling. You already know all of this. I don't need to, be projecting all my stuff out there, but I do want to have I do want to make sure the conversation is at least present here,
Yeah, of
continued,
course.
so. And I know that at least on your website and your bio, and maybe you could elaborate on this more, but you do consider how promoting social justice for students of color, students of disability. I mean, I'm recalling a line on your site about that. What is what does that mean, and what are you doing, or what needs to be done in that regard?
Yeah, so a combination of things for me, and I think that I'm so fortunate, and I can't stress this enough, to be able to approach these things from different angles, right? So I teach social work practice, so I'm teaching the future social workers of the world.
Mm,
And I forgot about this course that I recently started, but this I teach a school social work practice class, where I'm teaching social workers who would like to go off and work in the school system, just about the different concepts and the different theories that you should put in practice and the different modalities that you should follow.
okay.
And so on one end, I am addressing that by teaching, the social workers that will go off into the world, because I once was a school social worker. And I think that that's where my passion for education and social justice issues within the educational system came from.
Mm,
And I think on the opposite end, in my research, and so all of my research that I do, or my publications, or my writings that I do, or that I'm in the process of doing, are centered around social justice issues, particularly in communities of color, and in communities of students living with disabilities.
mm,
And it's so multi-layered. And complex, right?
yeah.
Where you have these structures that are set, like mainly school discipline strategies,
Uh,
issues with the way that we diagnose our kids, right? Like
mm,
in how children of color are typically diagnosed with behavior or emotional disorders, rather than things like learning disorders or speech and language, or speech disorders. And so looking at all of these different concepts and the ways that we engage with our students in schools, especially again students with disabilities and students of color, and how we set them up for failure in the future, right?
mm-hmm.
But then on the other end, I'm also a licensed therapist, right? So I have a small private practice, where I have worked with many kids that were struggling with some form of disability, to teach them different practices and different coping skills that they can use in the classroom. And I've also done that work again as a school social worker. But
Mm,
I think the biggest thing that's at the core here is just we need to figure out a way to live in a world, especially when it comes to education, where we are engaging in education that's anti-racist and that's anti-ableist, right?
mm,
And it's this idea that when we are in schools, because again, it goes back to that piece where we talk about schools are not, the educational system is not flexible enough,
mm-hmm.
where we have these students who are struggling in some kind of way, and we put labels on them, and then we are forcing them to adapt to our standards.
Yeah.
And because we do that, right, again, we set them up for failure, because we're not teaching to their strengths and we're not giving them what they need.
Mm,
Um, And so my dissertation was just the opportunity to give those students a voice, right? To
Mm-hmm.
go and talk to those students and for them to tell me, like, what has your experience been like, being, suspended from school, expelled from school, punished, right, at school, or incarcerated because you had an argument or a fight at school, and how has that set you up now as an adult, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just hearing their feedback and getting their opinions about what needs to be done is, I think, the first course of action that we should take when trying to provide an educational system that's equitable, right? That gives
Mm-hmm.
all the students what they need and not just like an equal type of education across the board.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice for someone out there who may be a parent of a kid right now that is not being treated fairly or is being misunderstood? Like what can parents do to better advocate for their kids?
Yeah, I think that the first thing is to, become a little bit more knowledgeable about what's going on with your child.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you have a better understanding of your kid, you're able to advocate for them more effectively, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you aren't able to advocate for them more effectively, because that's common, right? Like, parents are not educators sometimes. And
Right.
so they don't know the ins and outs of the rights that their students have when they need a little bit more, like, extra help. They don't know the rights or the ins and outs and laws and policies of like an IEP. And
Totally.
so I always say that there are opportunities to seek out advocates. And so I do a little advocate work as well, where if I have a parent who is unfamiliar with the system and they know that their kid needs help, I can help them, I guide them along the way to say, okay, here are the different options, like based on what's happening with your kid, based on the reports that we have, here are the different things that you should be advocating for.
Mm.
And so I would encourage parents to try their best to get an advocate, educate themselves a little more about what's happening with their kid. And if they don't have the resources to educate themselves, because that's a thing too, is to make sure that they stay on top of the teachers and stay on top of people like the social workers in the school system who can give them extra help in trying to understand what to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are you now, as an advocate, are you working with parents who have college stage kids or all across the board?
So mostly when I do any kind of advocacy work, it's for parents who have kids in like a pre-K up into like 12th grade.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because college is a little tricky, because you're working with adults at that point, technically, right?
True.
Um,
Yes.
and so, it gets a little tricky. But the good thing about college, and about being in college, is that you can carry, if you have an IEP in elementary school or high school, you can carry that over into college, and you can also get resources into college. And a
Mm.
lot of people also don't know that as well.
Yeah. And I was just thinking that I know what an IEP is
Hmm.
because we had an experience with my 3-year-old. She's getting special help with her speech,
Hmm.
and but if I didn't have that, you'd be doing this interview, and I'd have to say, "What is an IEP?" So could you take a
Right.
minute and explain
Of
that for
course.
anyone listening who
Of
doesn't know?
course, of course, of course. So an IEP is something called an individualized education plan. And so what that is, it's a legally bounded document or plan that's created in the school systems that outline the needs of your child when they need special help for whatever reasons. There are a vast amount of disabilities and disorders that are covered within IEP. So you can have like genetic disorders, such as like things like Down syndrome. You can be a child living with autism, ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Like, there's so many different disorders that can be covered under an IEP.
Mm-hmm.
But basically what happens is your child is in school, the teachers will start to notice like something's going on, right? Either it's with their learning, their behaviors, or the way that they control their emotions or interact with other kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so from there, what'll happen is you'll go through a whole bunch of meetings where they'll do evaluation and assessment after assessment to deem whether or not it's appropriate to give your kid a individualized educational plan.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that plan does, it's like a contract between you, your child, the state or the school board, and the teachers about the things that the teachers and the system has to provide your child in order to put them on a path to success. And so depending on the type of disorder or the type of concern that they're having, right, it can be a math related concern, reading, a social skills, or a behavioral based IEP. But basically the IEP is saying that this child has a disability or disorder of some sort that is impeding their ability to function and learn at their maximum capacity. So because of that, right, we have to put things into place to pretty much bring them up to speed to where some of the other kids are.
Yeah, I think that if I would have heard you explain that before going through the process, I would have thought, wow, that sounds really, I would have thought about it in a negative way, but it
Yeah,
actually is such a positive thing to have your kid really evaluated on every level and to
absolutely.
know that the teachers know exactly what they need
Hmm.
and how to facilitate it. And yeah,
Yeah.
my experience with it, and thankfully, look, I can talk about it from the lens of she's my kid, like she's doing well. She's about to, like, she's outgrown her classroom in just being in school a month. She's gonna move to the next one. Like, she's moving quickly, and I know that's not the case for a lot of parents, and it can be
Right.
scary. um but I have to say, just knowing that everything is so clearly outlined and that she's getting the exact attention that she needs is awesome. It's really great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that, there are, there's always things, or there's always pros and cons to things, right? And I think
Yeah.
that overall, the society just hasn't done a good job in general with being open and welcoming to people who just need a little more.
Yes.
And so when it comes to things like an IEP, like I wish we lived in a world where everyone had an IEP, right?
Yes.
In school. So if you notice that there was something wrong, that kids didn't have to go through this full-blown process of being labeled to
Mm-hmm.
get the things that they need. But we're here right now, right? And so one of the things I like to say is like, okay, where are we right now? And how can we use the things that we have right now to be beneficial? And I think
Mm-hmm.
because of where we are right now, we're not in the place where all kids can have individualized education. And so because we're not in that place yet, we're just going to use what we have and see the ways that it can hopefully benefit us and benefit our kids.
Yeah, totally. I love that. And when we were going through it, I was obviously sharing with my therapist what was going on, and she's like, I want that for my kid. Like, but it
Yeah.
is like, I think you hit it head on. With, wouldn't that be awesome for every kid, right? But B,
Yeah.
just about society and the acceptance. I mean, I she was entered into a program called disabled preschool. I mean, it just was like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
the words, the language. I mean, I get it. Like, they're meant to just be efficient, right? And sort of
Hmm.
just explanatory. But the connotation and the stigma that my brain, my husband's brain, my family's brain went to when they heard disabled preschool, it was like, like, how did
Absolutely.
we get here? What does that
Yeah.
mean? I mean, it's
Yeah.
scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. So you said you do have a private practice.
Yes. Yes.
Who are you mainly working with there? What types of, you said you're working with kids, families, general? Yeah.
Yes. So for like my clinical work, so I do the advocacy portion. I can do that for like parents with young kids, but like for my actual clinical work, I mostly work with adolescents and millennials.
Hmm.
And so I love teenagers, are like my passion. Teenagers and young adults, and just because I am not, I like to believe I'm not that old, right? And so I think that there is a certain level of I don't know, of like sameness or familiarity when it comes to the population, because I'm not so far off, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you can talk to me in the ways that you would talk to anybody else, and I understand the slang, I understand what you're getting at. I'm
Mm-hmm.
starting to reach the point where I don't know some things, and some of my kids they're in college and they're like, "What? Like
Yeah.
you don't know what this means?" And I'm like, "Well, no, can you explain it to
Right.
me?" You know what I mean? So that's my population that I work with right now. And mostly for my adolescence, I didn't do this on purpose, but in practice, and I think it's because of the areas that I've always worked in private practice. I worked in Old Town Alexandria,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very kind of like predominant neighborhood. And then now with my new practice in New Jersey, I get a lot of people coming from like Princeton and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I get a lot of like high functioning adolescents. And so what that means is they typically do really, really well academically, but they struggle majorly with things like their anxiety and their depression and just like always being overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's where my caseload is right about now. And again, that wasn't necessarily like a preference. It's just sometimes with you, when it comes to your niche, like you just land there.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where I've landed. So it's still kind of like working with adolescents who have some sort of like emotional or living with an emotional disability, but in regards to their academics, most of them are like pretty high functioning.
Okay. And what do you wish, I've asked this before and I'm always curious the answer. What do you wish more people, more, adults, let's say, understood about adolescents? What are we not getting about them?
um One, that they need space to explore.
Hmm.
They need space to mess up and to get things wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and to experience natural consequences. Because if we all just thought back to when we were their ages, right, and how often our parents would tell us to do things or not do things, and how we did them anyway, and mostly because we were curious, right, and it wasn't our parents telling us not to do things that stuck with us. It was really that we did the things that our parents told us not to do,
Right.
and we saw that there was natural consequences from them, right? And you had to go back to your parents and explain some of these things. And so I think that that's the first thing. I think too is that adolescents need their peers.
Mm.
I think that, sometimes when it comes to families and your kid gets to a certain age and you start to feel like, well, they only want to be around their friends. They only want this, they only want that, right? Like they never want to hang out with me. And it's like, where they're at the age right now where peer support is extreme, right? Like almost more important than the support that they're going to get from like a family.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because they're at an age where they need to feel same to other people, right? Like they need to feel like a sense of belonging to other people. And so I hate when I have parents sometimes and it's just like, well, they're spending too much time with their friends. And it's like, okay, well, are they getting good grades? Are they on track and on target? Now, if they're not on track and on target, that's not necessarily a good reason to pull them away from their friends, but to have some encouraging conversations around how can we find a balance. So they need the freedom to explore, right? And you need to be able to be a safe space for them when they come back and they've messed up, because they will mess up. They need their friends, right? The connection to peers are greatly important, especially in middle school and high school. And that you gotta have a lot of patience, right? And so finding the patience that you may not have had, that your parents may not have had with you, is going to be extremely important when you're dealing with this age group, because they're still growing.
Yeah.
They're going to make stupid decisions, right? And they're going
Right.
to look back at them when they get older and they're going to say, well, that was dumb, right?
Right.
But there's no possible way that you can prevent them from failing. And I think that if we welcomed failure not necessarily as like the end of the world, but more so as a lesson to do better in the future, then we would go a lot easier on kids in this age group.
Yeah. You can hear your passion for it come through. It's
I love
really,
them.
I know, it's really cool. It's really
I
cool.
love them. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. And I think, like you said at the end, and just, bringing it more towards my audience, is that we can all benefit from that reminder of, letting ourselves fail. It's
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
and I guess even saying, what is failure? Did we actually fail, or did we
Right.
just take a misstep and learn something from it,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, in general, when it comes to mental health or therapy, what do you think is really misunderstood, or what stigmas do you want to see sort of like totally blown out of the water?
Um The major one that I can think of is that people feel like you need therapy when you don't feel good, right? And that's the only benefit of therapy, that people go to therapy when they're crazy or when they're sad. And I think that that's a big stigma as it surrounding therapy, because what we want is to give people what they need before it gets to that point,
Yeah.
right? Like before people feel like, they can't go anymore, or they're deeply saddened, or they don't want to do the things that they love anymore. And if we all had therapists at a certain point, right, that can coach us through life to
Right.
give us the skills and the tools that we need before we get to that point, we'd be at a different balance, right? And so I just want people to know that. And therapy isn't always like, oh, you come in and you sit on this couch and it feels like a drilling session, right? Like it should never feel like that. It's a conversation, right? It's a conversation. So I always say, like, if you think about your most comfortable conversations and where are you, like, think about that moment, right? And so for us in the Black community, boys and guys, or girls sometimes, like, go get their haircuts, right? And so there's this big thing about, like, the barbershop conversation in our community. And so I always say, well, like, you are in a therapeutic setting, right, at the barbershop, because you're spilling your guts there, you're getting some feedback there. But therapy is just having a one up, because you're getting those things from a licensed, trained professional that can really give you the tools you need to see this in a different way. Yeah. And so it's just like that, right? Like if it's your barbershop conversation, your hair salon conversations, your cafeteria talk, right? Therapy can definitely be that for you. It's just a one up because it's someone who's trained that can guide you through the process.
Yeah. Dr. B, do you have a therapist?
I do. Yeah. I do. I say to everyone that every good therapist has a therapist.
Yes.
And you can, I recognize, because I can self-reflect in that way when I need to take a step back and I need to think of things differently, but not always, right? Yeah. Like you need that extra person to kind of like vent to sometimes, and they can give you insight on how to explore your thoughts that maybe you could have never thought of, right? Yeah. Because it really is a third party, or a second party in some instances. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's funny, I had a woman named Kerrie Mohr on recently, and she's a therapist in Manhattan, and she said every now and then, like similar to what you just said, sometimes she doesn't recognize what she needs to know and think about and think through, and she goes, and sometimes I don't even recognize when I'm at the point where I need the check-in. And she goes, and sometimes my husband will look at me and go, do you think you should talk to Paul about this? I thought that was funny. She's like, I'm trained, and sometimes I don't even recognize it myself when it's time to go for basically a tune-up,
Absolutely. Because when you're in your thoughts, it's just you and you, right?
Yes,
like,
yes.
It's you and you. Now sometimes your you can be, kind and sweet and forgiving and smart and logical, but sometimes your you is you, right? Which is not at all that. So it does help sometimes for you to have that outside party, for sure.
Yeah. And I guess kind of the last thing I want to ask you, I ask mostly everyone on the show this: when it comes to taking care of yourself, how do you make it happen, and what do you do?
Oh my goodness. I do so many things, but there are some things that I choose not to compromise. And at one point of time, I was working every day except for Sundays.
Wow.
And, now I have a very full schedule throughout the week. So Monday through Thursdays are like crunch time for me. I have no air to breathe, like literally. But I am very, very adamant on my weekend time with my fiance. I am very adamant with self-care moments. So I make sure to get my nails done. I feel good when I think I look nice.
Okay.
So I make sure I get my hair done. I make sure that I keep my nails done, and I go shopping for clothes, and I carve out time to spend with my family and my fiance, because, I'm a natural born hustler at the end of the day, right? So I do a lot of things always, but none of it to me is worth it if you don't have time to just like breathe,
Right.
right? And enjoy it. So it's like I like to do all the fun things. I'm a foodie, I love wine,
Mm-hmm.
I love the movies and to shop and to travel. So
Yeah.
I make sure I probably have a lot more fun than I should, to be honest. Yeah.
But you make a point of, come the weekend, it's like you're not on the email, you're not, checking in with students. It's like that you've made that line in the sand.
Yeah, I mean, I won't say that I won't. I grade papers sometimes. I will respond to emails just because it's a force of habit,
Mm.
but I don't schedule anything.
Okay.
Because, if I feel like opening up my laptop on the weekend, then I will, right? Like I won't feel bad about it, but I don't specifically schedule to do things on the weekend.
Okay.
Sundays are kind of like my refresh days where I will grade papers and get myself started for the week. My Fridays and my Saturdays, I typically don't schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I typically don't schedule and I won't really open my email too much, but
Okay.
I sporadically I will. So I
Okay.
won't say that I won't, but it's not like
But it's a choice.
it's a choice.
Yeah.
It's a choice. Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
even hearing you talk about your Sundays getting, your stuff ready for the week, it's like that's self-care in itself, right? So
Yeah.
you're going into Monday feeling good, feeling together,
Prepared. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I always ask cuz it's I think particularly as women we just generally struggle with making that time for ourselves and sticking to it.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Dr. B, is there anything that you would have asked yourself today that I didn't think to, or anything that you want to leave people with today?
I don't think so. I think that I'm very appreciative and gracious for you having me on. This was amazing. And I think that the only thing I wrote a post the other day. So speaking about like what do you do to just relax? And I wrote a post the other day that's just saying like sometimes just take the space to just be
Mm-hmm.
and not always do.
Mm.
And so I think that that space to just be gives us the moment to just reflect on life in general, whether you're a parent who has a child that you are experiencing some challenges with, whether you're a person who's experiencing some challenges in your relationships, at work, at school, wherever you are. I think taking the second to just be
Mm-hmm.
and reflect can give you a lot of opportunity to figure out like where you go next.
Yeah, I love that. It's so true. I really relate to that. So thank you for sharing that. And I did notice you're recently engaged, right?
I am. I am.
Congrats!
I am.
It's so
Thank you so much.
exciting.
Thank you. Thank you. It's
Yeah.
fun. It's fun and expensive.
Yeah. I
Fun and
know.
expensive. Yeah.
I know, but it's such a fun time. It's going to go fast, but
Yes.
you've already got your weekends with him, right? But just enjoy it as much as you can because it's such a
Yes.
special time, that engagement period.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. And this was excellent. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So much passion. Ah, it's so invigorating talking to someone who is totally in alignment with where she's supposed to be. You can hear the enthusiasm and commitment in her voice when she speaks of her students and patients. And I definitely want Dr. B to have my kids' backs. We've talked about empathy in education on the show before with Diana Simon, who spent years not knowing she had ADHD, and with Dr. Freeman, who spent years working in higher education but ultimately had to leave for her own mental health. Education seems to be one of the most obvious systems in our culture to require empathy and diversity in teaching styles, in learnings, in everything, socialization. But unfortunately, we are hearing now again how that is not always the case. It's educators and counselors like Dr. B who will keep pushing the needle forward, but we can all do our part. Check in with your alma maters. How are the institutions you love and support doing in these areas? Check in with the schools your kids might attend. How are they doing? What active role can you take in creating a world where, as Dr. Butler said, is anti-racist and anti-ableist? In my experience, these larger issues can sometimes feel like either, well, that's not my problem, or someone else will do it, or what difference can one person really make? And I'm here to remind you that it is our problem. Someone else isn't coming. And you, like Dr. B, can be one person in a system, institution, or community that can make a difference for, most importantly, the kids. All right, boom, done. Think about it. Let me know what you think. Thank you, Dr. Butler. I so enjoyed getting to know you, and thank you for listening. Bye. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Sass is a production of Luann Nigara, Inc. This podcast is meant to be educational and not meant to replace professional therapy or professional medical attention. To learn more about today's show and what's new in my world, head over to sasssays.com. Thanks so much. Talk later.